is Lorna Ross, and I work at Accenture, and I am part of the Human Insights Lab, which we have some of our colleagues here. It's part of the global R&D centre that's just down the road at the dock. And so I'm going to do introductions for Professor Robertson tonight. As part of that series, I think a little bit just to kind of, for those of you who maybe haven't, this is our third in the event. And so in December we launched with a panel, which was wonderful, kicking off this idea of what it means to be human, an opportunity to kind of bring, we come from a really kind of deeply, tech and corporate culture, and we partnered with Trinity recently, and the Long Room Hub, trying to kind of find a group of colleagues and a kind of alternative perspective to help us in the tech and kind of commercial industry really think about the kind of future of humanity. We felt that that was a conversation we weren't ourselves really skilled to have, and so we've been loving this relationship with the Long Room Hub. So as I mentioned, we're in the third of the series. Last month we had Shane O'Neill, which was a great kind of kick-off in terms of a lecture, and he walked us through the kind of soup to nuts of humanity in terms of where we started as we began as an organism, and talked about our ultimate fatality and immortality. So it's been a really wonderful, the third in the series, which is great. I'm going to start reading some notes because Professor Robertson's it's hard to do you justice. I think Jane will probably do it better. But I wanted to just kind of cover really quickly, for those of you that don't know Professor Robertson, some of the highlights of his career. He's currently professor or emeritus professor of psychology here at Trinity College in Dublin, and he's co-director of the Global Brain Health Institute. He's a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist with a unique ability to apply his research to the pressures of everyday life. His recent work includes, books include Mind Sculpture, The Mind's Eye, The Winning Effect, and Stress Test. Professor Robertson is widely recognized as one of the world's leading researchers in neuropsychology, and is also the first psychologist in Ireland to have been elected as a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Professor Robertson has published over 400 scientific articles in leading journals, and also has contributed significantly to public communication and understanding of science in various media outlets. Professor Robertson's focus on the human brain's attention system has led to a number of innovative ways to measure how humans pay or sometimes fail to pay attention. He has extended his research to help develop new therapeutic methods that have resulted in improving cognitive function in aging and other populations. This work on attention has also created an important new theory about how socioeconomic factors, such as poor education, social deprivation, interact with the biology of the brain to increase the risk of dementia. So I'm for one, I'm thrilled and excited to be here, and privileged to be here tonight to kind of be able to kind of hear some of those stories. I think before I ask Professor Robertson to come to the podium and begin, I just wanted to remind you that we want to have a really active dialogue here today, and I think people are encouraged to tweet, and so I think that we're tweeting hashtags Hub Matters and Being Human. So any of you who want to share some thoughts with people outside of the room, I think we're also live broadcasting, right? So it's streaming. And for those of you who have a great evening tonight and want to tell people about it, this will be a podcast that is up on the Hub website. So if you leave here and wish that you had brought your friends with you, you can just share that with them tomorrow. And then we will have questions and answers afterwards. So again, if you have questions in the room, hopefully hang on to them, write them down so we can have a good Q&A afterwards. Okay, so let's get going. Professor Robertson, thanks so much.
Very generous very generous introduction, Lorna. Thank you very much. So I'd like to start tonight by asking you to do something. I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine something that you really want, say in 5 years' time. Not necessarily for you, but you want to happen. Something you want to occur or to happen in you or in other people or in the world in the next 5 years. Could you close your eyes for a moment and just try and visualize that? goal or desire. So, having done that, how many of you could do that? Okay. This is the take-home from what I want to say tonight. This is the essence of being human. To imagine things that do not yet exist and to work towards achieving. And this is what I mean. This essential human capacity that is a bridge to the future. So, this is a patent from 1888, an American patent that was awarded. And this was a device that allowed you, if you had been inadvertently buried alive, to communicate with people in the surface to say that there was a non-corpse in the coffin below. So you turned a lever and there was a signal, a swiveling visual signal in the grave above, and so the terrible 19th century Edward Allan Poe type fear of being buried alive could be assuaged. Here we have another 19th century patent also awarded, which was for a rat trap, which involved kind of Trumpian overkill. I wonder how many were sold. Now, this was not a patent awarded, but this was a French visualization en l'an 2000. 2000, year 2000. This is what's going to happen. How ridiculous, a man speaking into a loudspeaker, and it was converted into print. Ridiculous, fabulous. And here we have another one. The dream of every professor. You take one of your students and you set them to work processing the books that are poured prodigiously into the device, and then these are piped into the brains of the waiting students there. My goodness, would that sell? So that's what I mean by bridges to the future, by the capacity of the human being to imagine ridiculous things and then create them. I do believe that's the essence of humanity. But this is the bridge, but there's an obstacle to that progress. I want you to just think in your own minds about what that obstacle might be, maybe thinking in terms of what you wished for at the beginning of this lecture. What's the big obstacle that I'm thinking about? I'm going to try and keep you paying attention. I've studied attention, so I'm going to try and keep you paying attention for a little while by not telling you the answer quite yet. So it's not just technology where people envisage ridiculous things in the future. Extreme poverty was regarded as an essential part of humanity. And in fact, people like Malthus saw the rise in the population resulting in the inevitable extinction of billions of people that we couldn't sustain it. And poverty was a fact life we just had to live with. I think even Mother Teresa said that we need the poor, they will always be with us. But actually, the number of people living in extreme poverty has collapsed. Now, I'm drawing on Steven Pinker's wonderful book, Enlightenment Now. He gave a lecture in this very theatre last year as part of the Neurohumanities series. So here we have not quite the elimination, but the incredible reduction of extreme poverty. Literacy. Here we have a collapse in illiteracy in the world. And all of these are continuing projections. They're not stopping now. Here we have global child mortality. I remember when taking one of my children as a baby along to see an old lady in the house we were staying in Sligo, Rosie's cottage, to see Rosie. Taking the baby along to show Rosie. And Rosie looked at us and said, how old? How old? I said, 6 months. He'll survive. So there was Rosie, you know, in the 1990s, whose experience was that, you know, babies under 6 months very often did not survive. That is not what people believe or expect now. So here we have in all of these indices, we have this, the impossible being imagined and then being translated into reality. That bridge to the future, not just in technology, but also in human progress. And some scholars, some people scorn the very notion of progress and try and argue that human life is cyclical. Roussachon's view said a même chose, that progress is just the fatuous notion of a naive, logical positivist. That actually progress doesn't happen, and it's all a big conspiracy to make us feel as if there's progress, but actually there's not. Well, they're wrong. Progress is a magnificent and wonderful reality of the human species. It's only happened because of the bridge to the future. Because people have the capacity, as you did around here, to think of something that doesn't yet exist and create that by creating a path towards, including global child mortality. Number of world citizens living under different regimes, half now living under democracy. Democracy didn't happen by accident. This is a beautiful, wonderful invention of human beings and passed down through civilization in various ways to codify behavior, to accumulate knowledge, to create a situation that results in a reduction in wars, a reduction in enormous inequality, which is a feature of democracy. And here, remarkably, for those of us who are, you know, part of who were brought up, say, in the UK, for instance, where educationists like Sir Cyril Burt liked to portray intelligence as being genetically determined almost entirely, and therefore the school systems should be appropriately created that regarded only a small minority of the population as educable, and the rest were sent to terrible secondary modern or schools or not at all. You have that notion of fatalistic acceptance of people's position in life and targeting the privileges of education to only a few. And yet we see that by 2100, compared to the beginning, the tiny sliver of the world's population is getting a post-secondary school education, a third-level education. That tiny sliver becomes a huge tranche of billions of people whose brains have changed by education. And the proportion of people with no education, the absolute numbers go down somewhat, but the proportion becomes very, very small indeed. That has profound implications for the world and for people's ability to work together to build bridges to the future and create realities that do not yet exist. So we should be pleased, shouldn't we? We should be delighted. We should be having a party, going for a pint, celebrating. But there is this awful obstacle to progress. And what is that obstacle? Fatalism. The belief that we do not have control. The belief that we do not have control. So here's a couple of questions that were asked. So this is people being asked, all things considered, do you think the world is getting better or worse, or neither better nor worse? 10% of Swedes think the world is getting better. 6% of Americans, and 4% of Germans. Do you think that extreme poverty in the world has increased, decreased, or stayed the same? 10% in the UK, 5% in the USA, and 2/3 of Americans think that extreme poverty has doubled. Why is this? Why are our beliefs so out of kilter with reality? Well, this is from Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which I thoroughly recommend to you. This is a systematic content analysis of news reports in the New York Times in black, and then from a series of global broadcasts in light grey. This is from 1945 to 2010. And this is essentially a systematic and quantitative measure of the negativity versus positivity, the pessimism, the tone of the news reports. And what you'll see is this collapse in positivity that happened around 1965, which Pinker and others argues coincided with the loss of trust in government following the Vietnam War, the behavior of the American government during the Vietnam War. In particular, McNamara and Johnson concealing the fact that they knew the war was unwinnable, but did not kept telling the American public it was winnable, and so sacrificed the lives of tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of American and Vietnamese people. So here we have this strange dichotomy between what's going on in our minds, our belief about the world, and the reality about the world, about our feeling that things are getting worse, that they're not really controllable. And, of course, climate change, antibiotic resistance, biodiversity collapse, all of these things are similar problems facing us now, where it's very, very easy to feel pessimistic, to feel that nothing can be done. So, what I'm going to argue is that building this bridge to the future depends on our approach to these critical notions of fatalism and control. So let me just say this. Humans and animals love choice. They love being able to choose. Even if that means that they have to expend more energy. That's difficult for a functionalist to say. You've got two courses of action. You can do something without a choice, or you can have a choice of what to do. But this takes a lot more energy and effort. The outcomes are the same, yet you will always, nearly always, choose choice. Choose choice. So, what that means is being able to make choices, to have choice, in other words, to have control, is inherently rewarding. It is inherently rewarding for the human and the animal brain. Now, one of the features of fatalism and feeling of about life is the role of socioeconomic status. Many people would hold views that yes, it's a fact that the poorer you are, the more depressed you're likely to be. The poorer you are, the lower your life satisfaction is likely to be, and your health, and your life expectancy. And this happens within countries and across countries. Socioeconomic status is one of the biggest determinants of our fate as human beings. And so this study by Kaplan and Schooler in the United States took a very large sample of people And they looked at the level of depression symptoms in low income, medium income, and high income people. Yeah, and it's true. It's the rich won't get the pleasure. It's the poor won't get the pain. That fatalistic song. Big difference between these three. Life satisfaction. Poor, medium, high income. We just have to live with it. It's just part of life. Except, look at this group here. These are people who feel they have little control. Their perception of the world is that they don't have the capacity to exercise much choice. This is a very robust psychological measure. Ever since the last 50 or 60 years, this sense of people who feel they have control, whose beliefs are they have some control over their lives and the world, versus those who feel they don't have much control. And in these people, you get this enormous difference between socioeconomic groups. But look here. In people who have a high sense of personal control, that eliminates the socioeconomic differences between them in terms of their depression symptoms. It's an antidote to the harsh realities of socioeconomic disparity. And the same is true for life satisfaction. So, have we found an antidote? Have we found a possibility of negating or mitigating some of these harsh realities that shape our faith? So this notion of control versus fatalism brings us on to how we think about ourselves. Now, for thousands of years, and still in the world, many millions of people believe their behavior to be under the control of supernatural forces or entities or deities. And that has been, for most of our history as humanity, has been the era of God. And where the maximum control we can exert is through prayer and ritual. Then came the Enlightenment, the 18th century, the flourishing of it, when we entered the era of physics, where the discovery of the laws of the material world, of the universe, of cosmology, and the amazing mushrooming of scientific discovery that came from the application of the scientific method, of rationality, of empiricism to the world. These people who imagined the impossible, that well, you couldn't just assume that something was created by God. You wanted to try and find out how it was made, and what it was made of, how it worked. That bridge to the future. And that was the dominant era from the 18th century right up until the mid-20th century, when the physics almost exhausted itself with its amazing discoveries, cosmology and relativity, and quantum physics, extraordinary stuff that has completely changed our lives, and is partly responsible for these incredible advances we see in all these human factors that we should do. But then, thanks in part to Erwin Schrödinger's lectures given in this university just down the way there, Edmund de Valera brought him over to Dublin, and he started the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, and he wrote a book called What is Life, and there was a magnificent conference last year about celebrating the book, which Francis Crick, James Watson, Francis Crick read. And the aim there was to create the basis for understanding human life, essentially using the principles of physics to try and underpin the nature of life. And of course, the DNA structure was discovered And from that came the most incredible advances in all sorts of areas, particularly in cancer. And now we have gene editing methods like CRISPR, an extraordinary flourishing of human knowledge. And the thing is, I'll just flick on to the next one there. So just to show you the cancer improvement rates, thanks to that. The survival rates from all cancers are really steadily going up due to this amazing capacity of human beings to envisage something that doesn't yet exist and to work towards it, like the structure of a molecule. The most amazing effort that's deployed by people in the service of a fantasy, and they work towards it. They spend their lives, whole lives are burned out and they don't achieve them, but then on the shoulders of giants others get there. It's the most extraordinary human achievement based on this capacity to envisage something that doesn't yet exist and work towards it. But all of this is based on a conception of ourselves, our conception of the world, which, to quote Ernest Rutherford, the great physicist, everything is physics, all the rest is stamp collecting, which James Watson infamously bastardized into everything is physics, all the rest is social work. And you can detect the kind of contempt there behind that, because this is the reductionist model. The notion that essentially all this stuff, this social and psychological, and even some of the system itself, it's really just playing about. This is amateur stuff. The real aim, the real drive to get down to the very most fundamental atomic, subatomic mechanisms. And once we understand them properly and fully and have our unified theory, we will understand all the rest will follow. This is the reductionist enterprise, which has been incredibly successful, flying us about the world, giving us these incredible smartphones with a million times the capacity of the computers that took the Apollo to the moon. I mean, reductionism has been an amazing success. But there is a cost. There is a cost. And the cost is that feeling that we are machines, that belief that control exists somewhere else, which I sometimes call the curse of genetic fatalism. Be one manifestation of that. So in 2016, the population of England was 53 million. The number of prescriptions for antidepressants in that year was 64.7 million. Now, most of these are multiple prescriptions. It's not that there's extra people, it's not year-long taking for their dogs and things. No. But this is just a fraction, a part of the drug epidemic facing us. Anxiety prescriptions. Prescription painkillers. My wife, Dr. Fiona Doherty, had been telling me for years about both the antidepressant prescription and the painkiller problem. I hadn't appreciated it. But then the Nobel Prize in Economics was given to Angus Deakin, a Scotsman in the States, who showed that for the first time in history, in the developed world, apart from the Soviet Union in the 1980s, you had a decline in life expectancy among a particular group of Americans, that is, non-college educated whites. And they were dying, what were they dying of? Prescription drug overdose. Not that they were drug addicts, well, they became drug addicts. This was a corruption in the medical system, in the industry, allowing these drugs that should only be used for terminal cancer to be used for people with broken legs. I know a colleague in the States who herself went with a twisted ankle and she was handed, without even discussing it, a 2 months prescription for the heaviest opiates, and she hadn't even asked for it. She wasn't even in that much pain. So we have a terrible problem of, if you like, the medicalization of our minds, a kind of corrosive fatalism that's particularly playing out in disorders of the mind and brain. So this brings me to what I think is the fourth era, which is the era of mind. The biggest companies in the world now are not oil companies or steel companies. The biggest companies are information companies. Information is the commodity of the 21st century. And with artificial intelligence, that is going to increase even more. And the vehicle for information is the human mind. So, in my view, we are in the era of mind now, the 21st century, that is going to replace the era of biology, while still, if you like, on the shoulders of giants of physics and biology. But in order to build this bridge to the future, where we solve these seemingly insoluble problems of climate change, of biodiversity reduction, resistance, drug resistance, that to solve our problems together as human beings with these increasingly educated forces, we have to become highly sophisticated participants of the era of mind, where we realize that the challenges facing us, our very sense of identity of who we are, our skills, our self-respect, is going to be so threatened by artificial intelligence, by vast changes in technology, by robotics. We are all going to have to become master practitioners of control of the most complex entity in the known universe, which is the whole human mind, the human brain. So that's why I think this is the era of mind. Now, one of the downsides of the incredible achievement of the physicists and the biologists, the reductionists, miracle of the lengthening of our lives, has been that there is a correlation between the length of our lives and the risk of dementia. And so as we have this aging population, we have more and more dementia, which is a real challenge for the world. So many of us, people of my age, for instance, will be finding ourselves being given a test by our doctors or in a clinic. And this test will be one of the standard dementia screening tests, which will ask us to remember some words and then recall them, maybe to draw a diagram, to give some information, to do it's a cognitive screening test. And there are these very well worked out standard screening tests. So the study I'm just about to tell you about was carried out in England with a group of people about my age, just volunteers. They weren't, and they were. So if I walked in, I'm in my mid-60s. If I walked in, I'd be told, I'm just going to be doing a study here. This involves a study of 60 to 80-year-olds, and you were in the youngest cohort of the group. Okay. So you're in the young group of this study. The other people, half of them were told, this is a study of 50 to 65-year-olds, and you were in the oldest group here. So one group were told they were the youngest of the group in the study, and one group were told they were the oldest of the group in the study. And then there was one more manipulation. Half of each group had to read a scientific article that persuasively said, aging is associated with a general loss of cognitive function across all domains, memory, reasoning, attention. The other group, half of each of the old-young groups, were given a scientific article that said, aging is associated with a specific loss of memory function, reduction in memory function in the context of a preservation of general mental function. They then gave them the standard screening test for dementia. So a mixed group of people in the mid-60s. Standard screening test for dementia, that if you pass above a certain threshold, the conclusion would be you're at risk for dementia, you need to be sent to a clinic for further assessment, see if you have it. So you have 4 groups now. These are the 4 groups. Okay. 65-year-olds made to believe they were older, 65-year-old made to believe they were the youngest. Half of each group said there was a specific reduction in memory capacity with aging, and half of each group said in general loss of your marbles as you get older. So here's the results. Of the other group, there was somewhere between less than 20% met the criterion to be referred on. 70% of those who were made to feel older and who were made to feel fatalistic about their cognitive functions passed screening, were classified as needing further assessment because they were screened. That is a remarkable picture of people internalizing fatalistic beliefs about themselves, and then these beliefs acting as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how fatalistic we are shapes our futures as individuals, but also as a species. So this paper was done as part of the Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging, which is a study of about 6,000 Irish people from nationally representative sample from all over the country, aged 50 to 90. And this was a little window done over a 2-year period where 2 things were measured, among many others. One was how fast people could stand up from a chair and walk 3 meters. It's called the timed up and go task. The speed of walking is a very, very good measure of vitality. And the other was cognitive tests, memory and executive function tests over that 2-year period. So they looked at how these, in this particular study, how the walking speed changed over the 2 years and how the cognitive function changed over the 2 years. And what the authors, Ian Robertson and others, were interested in was the aging perceptions questionnaire, people's beliefs about their control. So just look at you can see all the questions there. Look at the 2 bottom ones in particular. I have no control over the effects which getting older has on my social life. Bottom right. As I get older, there is much I can do to maintain my independence. So that would be a positive control line. So people who had negative expectations, the more negative your expectations were about what aging entailed, and here are the 2 tests, the walking test and the cognitive test. Here's the walking test. You began to walk significantly slower over the next 2 years. For no other reason. Everything else was being ruled out here. Cardiovascular fitness, socioeconomic status. This is an expectation implanted in the brain, a fatalism, a feeling of lack of control over the aging process, that resulted in people ending up walking slightly slower at the end of that 2-year period. That would have all sorts of consequences, starting to walk slower. And then cognitive function. The more negative your expectations of aging were, the less sharp you became over that 2-year period. These beliefs about aging acted like 5th columnists in your brain, in your body, and you started to behave in ways just like the people in the clinic who were assessed, being told about aging. So many of them were classified as being at risk for dementia. You're getting a self-fulfilling prophecy here because of your belief in control, because of your fatalism. Now, this is hippocampus is a critical memory center in the brain, which tends to get smaller with aging. But here, Becca Levy and her colleagues in Yale, they showed that over a 10-year period, people with negative expectations of aging had a faster decline in hippocampal volume. There are reasonable physiological mechanisms that could explain this. I won't go into just now. And even more, if you like, concerning is this pathology in the brain that was done post-mortem after people had died, but we had measured their expectations of aging a long time before. And again, I say a caveat, this is correlation and not cause, but nevertheless, the people who had the lowest level of the Alzheimer's pathology in their brains had the lowest negative age stereotypes. There are potential physiological mechanisms for that as well that I won't go into here. So, what is it about choice and control? Well, I said they were inherently rewarding. And we have in our brains a single feel-good reward network in our brains, deep in the middle of our brains, that whenever anything nice happens to us, we get paid a compliment, we get a pay rise, we win the lottery. That nice feeling that comes from that is because of increased activity in this network, this dopamine-rich network in the brain. And just being able to exert control increases that activity, makes you feel happier and less anxious, because this increased dopamine activity in the reward network is a natural antidepressant and a natural anti-anxiety drug we produce ourselves. And that's one reason why the poor people who felt in control didn't differ in depression from the rich people who felt in control. Unfortunately, as we get older, the amount of dopamine in this reward network goes down. Okay? But is that inevitable, and is that caused by this reductionist, fatalistic, and down to what's happening in the molecules in your brain? Of course it is, to a certain extent. However, it turns out that exactly this measure, the dopaminergic activity in your brain, is significantly correlated with your socioeconomic status. So the richer you are, the more of this mood-enhancing dopamine activity you have. So if you like, being wealthy, being privileged, makes you happier, in part because of its effects in the dopamine network and the reward network. So I just want to come to the end by this remarkable study. Many of us are getting our genotypes done, and they're being informed of our risk for various horrible things. And this is very necessary for some conditions, for instance, where there's treatments, for instance, certain forms of breast cancer. However, being told you have a genetic risk for something has consequences far beyond just that information, because it goes to the very heart of this conception of who we are and what we are, this sense of control, if you like, this reductionism. I am just controlled by my genes, that fatalism. So this wonderful study, Alia Crum, who's an amazing scientist at Stanford. So there's two particular genes, and I don't pretend to know much about genes, so I'm not even going to pretend to say that I understand the physiology of these, but there's a gene that has been shown to affect how you respond to aerobic exercise. So depending on the allele of the gene you have, if you take aerobic exercise, you'll be more likely to get puffed, you're more likely to, your endurance will be lower, you'll be more likely to get sweaty and uncomfortable. So what they did was, they took people into an exercise lab. Took them into an exercise lab, and they genotyped them, okay? And they classified them actually, and this is a very valid, gene which does affect these things. People with high risk or moderate risk, or protective, if you like, So the protective ones are the ones who didn't show, who could exercise well without this discomfort, etc. But then, very cleverly, they randomly allocated each of these three true genetic groups, and they told them a little fib, some of them at least. They told half of them in each group that they were in the high-risk group, and half of them that were in the protective group. Okay, in each case. And then they put them on the exercise machines and looked at how long they exercised for, when they started to hurt, when they started to, and also they looked at a key physiological variable to do with their oxygen transfer in their lungs. And what they found was that being told your behavior and your physiology followed strongly your expectations, your beliefs about what your genetic profile was. Even the change in maximum CO2, O2. Okay? That physiological, this wasn't all cyclism, it was physiological variable. And the authors concluded in many cases, not in all cases, the size of the expectation effect was much greater. In most of the cases, the size of the expectation effect on both physiology and behavior was greater than the size of the actual genetic effect, because there still was a genetic effect. It wasn't the immune effect, it did. So then there was a second gene we looked at, which was a gene to do with appetite and satiety. So people do differ in their genetic profile in terms of how easy it is for them to stop eating because they feel full up, okay, after. And there is a protein that's expressed which is associated in the body, which is associated with that feeling of, I've had enough. And this is shown to predict obesity and overeating, this genetic profile. So what they did then was, in the second study, they did exactly the same design, okay, exactly the same design of getting people who had the actual genotype and then telling fibs to half of each of them that they had the high protective and the non-protective genotype. And then they gave them a meal to eat. And they asked them how full they felt, how satisfied they felt after the meal, and they measured this protein as well that's associated with that feeling of satiety. And there we go. This is what they found. Again, the expectation, the belief that your genetic profile was such that you were inclined to not feel full affected not only your beliefs, but actually the physiology of your body associated with that satiety. So that's why we have to be very, very, very cautious. In fact, we have to reject the curse of genetic fatalism while embracing the wonders of the genetic advances and biological advances that we live with. But that's why in the era of mind, we have to shake off the fatalism. So we need to bind together the era of physics. Sorry. The era of physics, the era of biology, the era of mind have to work together. The era of mind is on the shoulders of the giants, but we're only just beginning with the era of mind. That is our bridge to the future, and that is the means by which we will, as we have done the other terrible problems facing mankind, we will do that as well. And that's why we do accept reductionism, we do accept that our molecular structure affects our cognitive functions, but we accept also it's bidirectional. That our socioeconomic status does shape the dopaminergic receptors in the reward method. That the structure of our brains, the functioning of our genes, is affected by the thoughts in our mind and the emotions we have. Genes are switched on and off, proteins expressed or not, depending on the moment-to-moment status, not only of our own minds, but our relationships with other people, our relationships with our population, our optimism, our fatalism. So long as we avoid the main obstacle, we can do this bridge to the future. We must avoid fatalism. Thank you very much.
My name's Ruth Barton, and I'm Deputy Director of the Long Room Hub, and I'm just stepping in to orchestrate the Q&A, so don't think you can sit down here. In fact, you have to run up to the stage to prove the activity quota. Can I invite people to ask questions? We have 20 minutes each for questions, and we have people with microphones, so can I just on the ground, pop your hand up in a conspicuous way, and the microphone will materialise at your side very swiftly.
So, question here.
Hi Ian. Hello, how are you? Firstly, thank you very much for a tremendously interesting talk. And what struck me, I don't know if Henry Ford said it or not, whether you think you can or you can't, then you are right, which is kind of mindset related. And Carol Dweck in Stanford has gotten huge press in the last couple of decades because of the growth mindset book, which corporations worldwide are sucking up from the hype holds. But my question to you is, when you look at artificial intelligence and robots versus humans, and look at all of the talk about the impact of technology and AI on the demise of jobs for humans and erosion of ability to earn income, how do you think that plays out in terms of fatalism and attitudes to socio-economic status? Because it's fed by the media, this almost fatalistic attitude, when in effect humans will always be in control in my mind, and I'm not a fatalist in that regard. Where's your thoughts at in the press on this, which is overwhelmingly being bartered around the place? And I think your talk is a brilliant antidote to it, so I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Fantastic question. You cannot be a Pollyanna. If you live in a grossly distorted tax system that privileges the very few, as happens in the United States, for instance, and you cannot safely, get health care, if it's just so difficult for you to live at the bottom of the socioeconomic rung, as happens in too many countries, there is a limit to the can-do attitude. There is a limit to the exercise, if you like, personal control in the context of that socioeconomic reality. So we must recognize the balance that's required here. But we must also recognize, if we take a kind of activist approach, political approach, and say, look, we have to change the social structures, we have to change the political system. Yes, we have to, but we must also accept the responsibility we have ourselves within certain limits to mitigate some of the corrosive effects of these things. And political action and advocacy is a really powerful way of making disempowered people feel that they have some control, which lifts their moods. That's why Trump was elected. That's why Brexit happened. It was a political action that gave a sense of, why, finally I have some choice and control, even though in both cases it was absurd. But that lifted mood actually increased dopamine activity in the reward network. So, but the thing is about journalists is journalists need to cop onto themselves and realize, okay, bad news sells papers, maybe in the short term, but what you're getting is a flight to the social media, a flight to refuge from the bad news. So I think that what we need is more science, more journalists to read Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, and we need to cheer people up with the thought that they have between their ears the most complex entity in the known universe, which they are captain of, and they can build their own futures. Maybe not on their own, but certainly with other people. We should be optimistic about that.
Thanks. to introduce yourself when you ask the question. We have a question here. One back there, and another question here, another question there. So we'll try to reach as many of you as possible, both physically and in fact.
Hi. She says that, sorry.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, I'm here. Thanks very much for your talk. It was really interesting. Full disclosure, I am a journalist, so it's good to know what we can do better. But speaking about kind of, you just mentioned political activism and political action. And just to kind of play devil's advocate here, how do you confront people who feel like they don't have that control, though, in the sense of, like, for example, in the Dahl climate emergency bill passed, but now it's being stalled by committee stage. In the United States, Trump, yes, did win, but it was from the Electoral College. He didn't win the popular vote. So how do you kind of confront fatalism in an institution that isn't reflecting, in some cases, democratic will? Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a great question. So I think people, there's a critical component about choice and control, and that is action. It's just taking one small step. People too often, when they feel that they can't control it because of, say, the particular election system, oh, I can't decide who the president is, so I'm just going to give up. So most people, young people in the States, don't vote. Whereas if each of them, and it's the same with climate change, if each of them took one small step forward, not only would that combined small step have an effect, because more people would vote, and someone would see you voting, so your friend would vote, as a cascading effect. But taking that step in itself is a choice. It's an exercise of control, lifts your mood, makes you more optimistic, reduces your anxiety, makes you more likely to take another step. So there's a virtuous cycle there of action. So you must always tailor your goals to what's feasible, but trying to exercise control within a domain within which you can realistically exercise control. And then when you link up with hundreds, thousands, millions of people, there's where you get the big leaps of these a million small steps resulting in the change.
Thanks. We have a couple of here. Great. Thank you. Just introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It was fascinating and truly inspiring. My name is Jo Harlos. I was thinking whilst you were speaking about Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid and the things he was able to do to his students to really inspire them and make them really break the barriers of their own physical ability. And whilst I was thinking about Mr. Miyagi, I was also thinking whether the issue that you were describing here is something that perhaps affects our culture, Western culture, is the malaise of the Western world, more sort of than some other cultures, where that fatalism, which is partly from what I gathered in your lecture, linked to our division of body and mind, which is not as present in the Eastern world. So I just wonder what's your opinion, and if there is anything we can learn from the Eastern wisdom to help us find the course of fatalism.
Thank you for a fantastic question, and I'm not sure I'm up to answering it. But the answer is, I do think that we have a huge amount to learn from the non-mind-body dualism that really has. It's the mind-body dualism that's kind of caused a lot of the medical problems. It's sort of medicalization of the mind that's happened. But also in other aspects of medicine, failing to see the mind and body as being integrated. So I do think that, for instance, in the whole area of meditation, I mean, the research in meditation, which is of course derived from Eastern traditions, is remarkable. Its effects on immune function, its effect on the expression of proteins, its effect on the brain, is quite remarkable. So I do believe that our ability to navigate the human mind, the era of mind, to navigate consciousness, and to start to enjoy this incredible privilege that being aware in this world confers on a human being, that will free us from the worries about our jobs being taken by artificial intelligence and machines being smarter than us, which they will be, And we can go into a realm of meaning, of where we see ourselves as pioneers of the universe becoming conscious of itself, which I think is the case. And we can find meaning. But what that prerequisite for that is for the world has to reduce inequity. Because with the rising population, we just cannot tolerate these huge differences in wealth. We just have to find ways. And as we find lose jobs from automation like that, that's why things like the universal wage or something like that frees people from the terrible anguish of not being able to live properly. If we do that, then there's a huge opportunity for us really to enter the era of mind, I think, and everyone becoming an astronaut in this realm of consciousness. And Eastern wisdom is going to be a big source of help in that, I think.
Okay, we've got something here, here and here. Should we take two questions, one after the other, and invite Ian to give two answers? So we've got one here, thank you, and this guy here, if you don't mind, thanks.
Hey, computer science here in secondary. And so you said that there's a need for more left-wing economic policy, such as the universal basic income. And then you were talking earlier about how we've seen a lot of improvement and people having to have envision something in their mind and then achieve it. But would you not say that a lot of what drives people originally and biologically we're kind of detained to have a economic necessity, driving us to attain these things at some level or another. Although it is a nice idea to have things such as the universal basic income, and perhaps a certain degree of cushiness will be nice. Would you not say that it's kind of necessary to have some drive?
Okay, thanks for.
Can we take one more question?
Yeah.
You have a microphone, yeah.
Sure. Thanks for the lecture. I found it utterly fascinating, and I was particularly impressed by being able to give an hour-long talk on choice without mentioning determinism or free will. I do kind of want to ask you whether perhaps fatalism is determinism by another name, and whether, in your opinion, we do have free will, given your emphasis on the importance of choice, or whether that's not the important point, whether, regardless of whether it's choice or the illusion of choice, it's having that choice or illusion that's the important component there.
You must be a neuroscientist.
Sadly not.
Okay. I will come to that. Both great questions. So I think you were asking whether, if you like, the basic getting out of bed in the morning is a kind of something that we only choose to do because of necessity. Is that right? And that maybe universal basic income would be subvert that and if you like, take away that kind of, that energizing need. Is that your question? No, it's a good question. It's an important question, and I think that there are problems. There have been problems with the Western social welfare systems, which can sometimes disincentivize people from taking steps, for doing stuff. There's no doubt about it. So I think it's not I'm not making a Jeremy Corbyn prescription or a kind of fascist in Italy prescription for universal wage. What I'm recognizing is that we cannot continue where enormous wealth is concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, because that bubble is going to burst. There's going to have to be a way, if you invent an app that suddenly makes taxi drivers redundant, and you get all the profits of the taxi drivers. We just can't let that happen in an unfettered way. We have to find a way of evening out that while still benefiting from the technology. But I do agree with your point that there's something, it's not an easy, there's no easy, simple prescription here, and there are various experiments going around in the world, empirical, good rationalist enlightenment thinking, saying let's logically think, let's examine what actually happens when you give a universal wage, does X happen, does Y happen? But no, it's definitely something we have to bear in mind. In terms of free will, we have free will. We have free will, and I don't care. That's heresy among reductionist neuroscientists. But our brain is too complex for us not to have free will, and our brains are also connected with millions of other brains. And even if you take pure randomness in that system, we cannot possibly have our actions determined. So I remember wrestling with this in my second year at university, and we were learning about Cattell, the great personality psychologist. And Cattell was a complete reductionist and determinist. He said, and he had this thing called the specification equation. So he said, if I do my personality tests and I measure these personality variables and your particular individual place in these, and then there's a number of situational variables I'll measure as well, I will come up with an equation that will precisely predict your behavior in any situation. That was his genuine scientific aspiration. And I remember being tortured by this because it made me feel like a machine. It made me feel out of control. It made me feel depressed. And then one day it just came to me. If I know, I'm a psychologist, so if I know what the equation is, I can defy it. So simply knowing the equation, knowing what's determining me, I can choose. Jean-Paul Sartre, Roads to Freedom, the guy in the French bar, slices a knife through his hand to prove that his actions are not determined, you know. So no, free will exists. It's an absurdity to think that somehow we can come up with every action, every behaviour, it can be determined and measured, you know, by the absurd quantum physics or whatever. Yeah.
I can see at this stage that everybody in the room has a question. So we're going to limit it to 2 more. Yeah. Then we have 2 more questions, and we'll do question, and then invite you to finish up with 2 answers.
I think you'll agree that democracy, if it spreads, will help eliminate the fatalism. You know, it's sort of taking hold in South America very well. If China were to become a democratic country, there would be an end to depression, much less depression, and fatalism, and possibly poverty, lack of enthusiasm. So I think you'll agree that, democracy is almost most essential.
Well, I was so struck by seeing in Nigeria where the election was postponed, and to see these people crowding and bursting through the gates. They've been queuing, thousands of people, ordinary people, bursting to go and put their name in a ballot paper, even though they knew probably the election was about rigged anyway. But that exercising choice, the effects in the human spirit of that, and democracy is the greatest invention of the human spirit.
So one final question. I'm sorry, there's only one final question left.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful talk. So you mentioned about genes and how they change their functionality in response to our emotions and thoughts. So which means the thoughts are really powerful. So my question here is that how to keep our thoughts healthy and feel in control? Because stuff like simply saying that I try to focus on the positive stuff and get rid of the negative and try to stay positive does not really work. So what do you suggest for that?
So now that's a very good question. So how do you exercise this control when sometimes it feels that you don't have it? And it's not easy. It's a bit like, you know, you've never seen a bicycle before, and someone says to you, "Oh, there's a bicycle there, just ride that." And you go, I've never ridden it. How do I do that? Well, actually, controlling your mind is much more complicated than controlling a bicycle. So you have to learn to do it. It takes effort and steps. And that's where we need, in the era of mind, to really all become expert. And we know an enormous amount in psychology now. We know an enormous amount about to answer, what to do precisely to answer your question there. But it's not something I can say just like that. But what I'm not going to say is that, oh no, yeah, you're right, we can't do it. Absolutely not. There's acres of brilliant research that knows how we can learn. But the trouble is, yeah, this is my finishing word here, the trouble is, and someone mentioned Carol Dweck, a brilliant scientist, if we hold a fatalistic mindset about ourselves, a fixed mindset, if we believe that who we are and what we are and our capacities are determined by biological or other factors outside of our control, and then we say, oh, okay, I'm going to try, I'll try and exert some control. The first time you get on that bike and you fall off, you're going to say, see, it doesn't work. Okay? You know how long it takes to learn to ride a bike? Well, it's the same, similar learning process with learning to control your emotions, to control your mind. But prerequisite of that is that you believe that control is possible. And believe me, it is.